most forensic scientists in the United States are employed by or work directly underneath the supervision of law enforcement. And because you have these two communities together, the scientific community and this law enforcement community together, it creates a friction because they have very different missions. Law enforcement has a mission to identify suspects, to interview and apprehend them, and then prosecute them, put them in jail. That's their mission, and that's an important social function. A society cannot function without that, so it's absolutely vital. The scientific community is essentially intended to be a group of truth seekers. They're trying to objectively establish the facts, objectively interpret the evidence without bias or prejudice, and without any interest in the use of the final outcome. They're trying essentially to get to the truth, so that that truth can then be used by either investigators or the courts to do their jobs. When you employ forensic scientists by law enforcement, the missions commingle, and there's overt pressure that is pushed down to the forensic science community from that more aggressive, more muscular law enforcement group. The scientist who works in the crime lab is merely an extension of the police officer's will, because the only customer that they have is the police. And so for them, they should just basically work in-house and be controlled. And so that way they can control the reports, they can control the testimony. And if they start saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, they can pressure them, or they can just set them aside or give them orders and put them over here. So that notion, that's the generational change that has to happen, that the forensic science and law enforcement are even connected at all. That they were ever connected is a problem, but one that can be remedied. And I don't mean making it independent, just separate from the government. I mean just making it independent from the budgets of law enforcement. That's the biggest change that needs to happen. Already we agree that this is the case. The forensic science community has already spoken on this issue, but the law enforcement community that controls the forensic science employees does not agree. And so that issue, when you talk about the reforms that are necessary, almost to a person, that issue, which has been said to be one of the biggest and most important issues of our time, that issue is ignored in all reform efforts. And that's another thing that I wanted to bring into the forefront, because the vast majority, 79 to 85% of all forensic fraud that's committed is committed on behalf of law enforcement by prosecution employed forensic scientists. And that is a huge number. There are a number of motives, but essentially you can start with the motive of noble cause. There's some people who believe that they are doing something for the good of mankind, for the good of others, for the good of the community. They have a bad person that they need to get off the streets, and therefore there's nothing that they do matters as long as they get that result. The ends justifies the means, and this notion is ingrained in many people, especially in law enforcement, that, well, sometimes you got to go around the paperwork, sometimes you got to drop a little evidence, sometimes you got to lean into a suspect a little too hard. Sometimes you got to turn the cameras off and say some things that you shouldn't be recorded saying. And that notion, that belief, pervades popular culture, and popular culture is where a lot of law enforcement and forensic scientists get their idea of their professional identity. And it also creates an expectation on the part of the public that law enforcement and forensic scientists are doing these things to get the bad guys, and that's okay. And those things working together create this notion that noble cause corruption is all right. The way that it was put in the recent NAS report in 2009 was that those who are in the current forensic science community are too wedded to the system, which is broken, to fix it. Because they've got the golden handcuffs on. They are manacled to this thing, and they will hide and they will protect, because they're not going to get promotions, pay raises, or grants if there's fraud or bad things going on in their lab. So their motive is to conceal it. I wrote this almost as a love letter to my colleagues who are in government labs, who are constrained because they have employment contracts which forbid them from speaking openly about the problems that they see around them every day. They can only complain up, and if they complain out, they're fired, they're gone. And they have to fight for whistleblower status. So very often you have these very very honest, very well-meaning forensic scientists who work in these labs under a directorship that is either absent, or is pro-prosecution, or is anti-science, and does not support them at all. So they're just stuck in this employment situation that they cannot escape, because they got the golden handcuffs on, they got a mortgage, they got kids, they got responsibilities, and they're trapped in terms of their employment, but they can't report. And if they do report up, they're seen as a problem, so they're not going to get promoted. If they do report out, they're going to get fired. So this, to me, is written to give voice to the many, many thousands of forensic scientists that I know who are suffering in employment conditions that are utterly unacceptable, and that compel them to do things or to look the other way when they shouldn't. There are reforms that we can engage in that would actually solve some of these problems right away. The number one type of forensic fraud is resume fraud. Happens in it's 1/3 of the cases right out the gate. And it's because people who employ forensic scientists, they don't check resumes. That's what it comes down to. If they just did resume checking, boom, 1/3 fraud gone. Right off the top, if we just checked resumes. But then it's not just that, it's getting rid of people. The second thing is the drug problem. Boom, another third of fraud gone. If we just got rid of people with drug addictions. You know, these reforms, they're realistic, they're simple, they're common sense, but it's somebody speaking it out loud who is not going to be fired from their crime lab for saying it. And so my takeaway is I hope that my colleagues are, when they take away something from this, I hope they take away that they see the science, they see the reforms, and they don't feel so alone. That's what I'm hoping.